Chapter 2. It was a quiet street, a few turnings east of the high road. Edwardian houses with neat front gardens and off-road parking. Many, like number 48, had been divided into flats, though this house was not itself divided into its neighbours. A tarpaulin shielding the side alley, uninformed officers stationed at each corner of the front lawn, and crime scene tape fluttering above the flower beds. Thorn arrived just before 8, and it had already been dark for almost an hour. It was light enough in the kitchen of the downstairs flat, where the beams from twin arc lamps illuminated every mote of dust and puff of fingerprint powder bounced off the blue plastic suits of the CSIs and washed across the linen on the floor. Retro-style black and white check, its simple pattern ruined by a few spots of blood and by the body they had leaked from. "I think I'm about ready to turn her," Bill Hendricks said. In the corner of a crime scene investigator was scraping up the edge of the low cupboard. She barely glanced up. That'd be a first. Hendrick grinned and gave the woman the finger, and then looked around and asked Thorn if he wanted to come closer, to squeeze in where he would get a better view. Thorn doubted that the view would get any better, but he walked across and placed himself between the still and video camera operators, opposite the pair of CSIs who were preparing to give Hendricks the help he needed, to add the necessary degree of strength to his gentleness. "Okay, easy does it." The woman was face down, arms by her sides. Her shirt had been lifted and had ridden up, showing purplish patches on the skin, just above her waist where the liver mortars had started, and revealing that her bra had not been removed. "Something, I suppose," female CSI said as she walked past. Thorn raised his eyes from the body and looked towards the single window. There were plates and mugs on the draining board next to the sink. A light was flashing on the front of the washing machine to let somebody know that the cycle had finished. There was still a trace of normality, assuming they didn't get a result in the first few days. Thorn would try to come back a second point. He found it useful to spend time where the victim had lived, even more if it was also where they had died. But he would wait until they didn't have to weave between crouching CSIs and negotiate the depressing paraphernalia of a crime scene, and until the smell had gone. He remembered some movie where the cop would stand in the houses where people had been murdered and commune with their killer. "Was this where you killed them, you son of a bitch? Is that where you watched them from?" All that shit. For Thorn, it just came down to wanting to know something about the victim, something other than what their last meal had been and where their liver weighed at the time of death. What their liver weighed at the time of death. Something simple and stupid would usually do it. A picture on a bedroom wall, the biscuits they kept in the kitchen cupboard, or a book they would never finish reading. As for what went on in the mind of the killer, Lorne was happy knowing just enough to catch him, and no more. Now he watched as what remained of Emily Walker was moved, saw the hand flop back against the leg as she lifted and turned in one slow, smooth movement, saw those strands of hair that were not caked in blood fall away from her face as she was laid down on her back. "Cheers, lads." Hendricks worked with a good team. He insisted on it. Thorn remembered one CSI in particular back when they were content to be called scene of crime officers, handling the particularly decomposed body of an old man no better than if it were a stack of spuds. He'd watched Hendricks pushing the Soko up against a wall and pressing a heavy tattooed forearm across the man's throat. He couldn't recall seeing the two of them at the same crime scene since. The cameraman stepped forward and went to work. When they'd finished, Hendricks mumbled a few preparatory notes into the digital recorder. "How much longer, Phil?" Thorne asked. Hendricks lifted one of the dead woman's arms, began bending back fingers of the fist that was closed tight. "Hour and a half?" The thick Manchester accent stretched out the pathologic's final word, flattened the vowel. "Two," at a push. Thorne checked his watch. "Right. You want a promise or something?" Thorne did his best to summon the right expression. Something conspirational and devilish, but he wasn't sure he'd managed it. He turned to see where Detective Sergeant Dave Holland had got to. "She's got something in her hand," Hendricks said. Thorne turned back quickly and bent down to give a closer look. Watched as Hendricks went to work with his tweezers and lifted something from the victim's face. It appeared to be a small square of plastic or celluloid, dark and wafer-thin. Hendricks dropped it into an evidence bag and held it up to the light. "Piece of film?" Lon asked. "Could be." They stared at whatever was in the bag for a few more seconds, but both knew they would all only be guessing until the Forensic Science Service laboratory had finished with it. Hendricks handed the bag over to the evidence manager to log and label, and carefully fastened polythene wraps around both the victim's hands before moving further up the body. Thorne closed his eyes for a few seconds, let out a long breath. "Can you believe I had a choice?" he said. Hendricks glanced up at him. He was kneeling behind the victim's head and lifting it so that it was resting against his legs. "Bridgestock gave me the option. More fool you. I could have let Kitson take it." "This one's got your name on it," Hendricks says. "Why?" "Look at her, Tom." Emily Walker had been early 30s thereabouts, dark hair streaked with a little grey and a small star tattooed above one ankle. She was no more than 5 feet tall, her height emphasizing the few extra pounds which, judging by the contents of the fridge and the magnet on the door that said, "Are you sure you're hungry?" she was trying to lose. She wore a thin necklace of brown beads, and there was a charm bracelet around one wrist, dice, a padlock, pair of fish. Her shirt was denim, her skirt was thin cotton, the same pillar-box red as the varnish on her toenails. Thorne looked across the sandal that had been circled on the lino-closed fridge, at the decorative bottle a few feet away, with what looked like balsamic vinegar on the inside and blood and hair caught in a few of the glass ridges on the outside, and beyond to the light still winking on the front of the washing machine. His hand drifted up to his face, fingers moving along the straight white scar on his chin. He stared until the red light began to blur, then turned and wandered away, leaving Hendricks cradling Emily Walker's head and talking quietly into his dictaphone. There was nothing holding the plastic bag in position over the victim's head. Assume that the killer kept it in place around the victim's neck with his hands. Bruises on the neck suggest he held her there with a great deal of force until the victim stopped breathing. Holland was standing out on the patio at the rear of the house, watching half a dozen uniforms combing flower beds. There were arc lamps out here too. But this was only an initial sweep, and more officers would be back at first light to conduct a fingertip search. "So no forced entry then," Thorne said. "Which means she knew him, possibly." Thorne could smell cigarettes, and Holland wanted one himself for a second or two. or she answered the door and produced a weapon, forced her back inside. Holland nodded. Let's see if we get lucky with the house to house. Look like the kind of street where there's plenty of curtain twitching. What about the husband? I only have 5 minutes before they took him to the hotel up the road, Holland said. In pieces, much as you'd expect. Trying too hard, you reckon? How do you mean? Sounds like he wanted everyone in the street to see just how upset he was after he called us. You heard the 999 tape? No, Thorne shrugged. Just wishful thinking, Holland said. Right? Yeah, maybe. It was getting a little chillier. Thorne shoved his hands inside the plastic suit and down into the pockets of his leather jacket. Be nice if it was a simple one. I can see it, Holland said. Nor could Thorne. If he were being honest, he knew only I can't see it, Holland said. Nor could Thorne, if he were being honest. He knew only too well how domestic violence could escalate. Had seen the way a jealous boyfriend or a domineering husband could lose it. He blinked, saw the flop of the arm as the body was turned. Spots of billabocks red against black and white squares. Not a simple one. Maybe he was just that upset, Holland said. How many of these have you done? Thorne pulled out his cheeks. There was no need to answer. Right, and still can't imagine what it must be like. Not even close. Holland was 15 years younger than Thorne. He had been working alongside him for more than 7 years, and though the fresh-faced newbie was long gone, Thorne still relished the glimpses of someone who hadn't been totally reshapen by the job. Holland looked up to him once. Holland looked up to him once. Had seen him as the kind of copper he would like to become. Thorne knew that. He knew equally that Holland was not the same as he was. Not where it mattered, and that he should be bloody grateful for it. Especially when it's a woman, Holland said, you know. I see the husbands and boyfriends and fathers, how it hits them. And it doesn't matter if they're hysterical or furious, or sitting there like zombies. I've no bloody idea what's happening inside their heads. Don't knock it, Dave, Thorne said. They both looked across at laughter from further down the garden, where one of the officers had obviously stepped in something. Watched as he scraped the sole of his shoe across the edge of the lawn. So, where were you skivvying off to earlier then? Holland asked. Sorry? When all this kicked off, Thorne cleared his throat. Louise had been fine about him taking the job on. When he popped into the hospital to drop off her stuff, she was already in bed working her way through a copy of Heat and trying to tune out the incessant chatter of a woman in the bed opposite. He'd asked if she was sure. She looked at him like he was being stupid and asked why she wouldn't be. He told her to call if she wanted anything, if she needed him. She told him not to worry and said that she could get a taxi back when it was all over. She had to. Dentist, Thorne said. And now with the Nazi hygienist. The woman's like something out of a marathon man. Holland laughed, said, Is it safe? I'm telling you. They remade that film, you know. Holland waited for Thorne to take the bait and looked at him. But they had to call it Snickers Man. He laughed again, seeing that Thorne was doing his best not to. You told Sophie back on the fags? Thorne asked. Holland shook his head. Got a clove department full of extra strong mints. Got a glove compartment full of extra strong mints. He leant down and spat into the drain. Stupid, really. 'Cause I'm bloody sure she knows. Just doesn't want a row, I suppose. Holland and his girlfriend were another couple who had been talking about getting out of London and about Holland giving up the job. Thorne wondered if that was something else that was not being mentioned for fear of reigniting an argument. He'd always been convinced that Holland would stay where he was, but he would never have said so. If he so much as got wind of Thorne's opinion, she would fight tooth and nail to do the opposite. So he kept his mouth shut, content that Holland was still there. We'll get the official ID done first thing in the morning, Thorne said. Then bring the husband in for a chat. Fair enough. You never know, we might get lucky. Holland nodded across to where the uniformed officer was now working at the sole of his shoe with a twig, flicking out the shit. That kind of lucky, he said. They both looked up as a plane passed, low overhead, lights blinking, on its way to Luton. Thorne watched it move fast across the clear sky and swallowed hard. 8 weeks earlier, he and Louise had gone to Greece together for their first proper holiday as a couple. They had spent most days lying by a pool reading trashy books and done nothing more culturally demanding than work out how to ask for beer and grilled squid in the local tavern. They both tried hard not to talk about work and had laughed a lot. One day, Louise had rubbed cream into Thorne's shoulders where it got burned and said, "This is as far as it goes for me in terms of non-sexual intimate contact, alright? I'm not into squeezing other people's blackheads, and I will not be wiping your ass if you break both your arms." She bought the pregnancy test kit on their final morning there, used it just before they'd gone out to dinner that last night. Thorne wasn't in the car when Hendricks came out. He checked his phone and tried both flats, but Louise hadn't got back yet, and there were no messages. He listened to the radio for a while, then called in to no avail. Louise's mobile switched off, and Thorne guessed it was too late to ring the hospital. Hendricks walked around the passenger side and got in. He changed out of the protective suit and was wearing black jeans and a skinny ribbed sweater over a white t-shirt. "Just about done," he said. Thorne grunted. "You okay?" "Sorry, yeah." Thorne turned and looked, nodded and smiled. A skein of red and blue ink was just visible above the neckline, but most of Phil Hendricks's tattoos were hidden, much to the relief of his supervisors. A good few of the piercings remained out of sight too. Thorne was happy to have been spared the graphic details, but knew that some had been done in honour of a new girlfriend, one for each conquest. There hadn't been a new piercing for quite a while. It was not what many people expected a pathologist to look like, but Hendricks was the best Thorne had ever worked with, and still, despite the many ups and downs, the closest friend he had. "Fancy a pint later?" Thorne asked. "What about Louise? She'll be fine." "No," Hendricks grinned. "I mean, she'll be jealous." "We'll make it up to her," Thorne said. In truth, he was the one who had suffered from jealousy. He and Louise had been together almost a year and a half, having met with Thorne, was seconded to help out on the kidnap case she had been working on. But it had taken her only a couple of weeks to get as close to Phil Hendricks as Thorne had managed in 10 years. There were times, especially earlier on, when he had been disconcerting, when he'd found himself resenting their friendship. One night when the three of them were out together, Thorne had got pissed and called Louise a fag hag. She and Phil had laughed, and Phil had said how ironic that was, because Thorne was the one acting like an old queen. Yeah, okay then, Hendrik said. He looked towards the house, from which officers had begun to drift in twos and threes. Mind you, if I'm going to be elbows deep in the poor cow first thing in the morning, I'd better just have a one. Well, I'm having way more than one, Thorne said. So we'd best go to my local. I'll give you a lift. Hendrik nodded, let his head drop back and closed his eyes. Thorne had given up trying to find any decent country music and had turned the radio into Magic FM. It was nearly 10 o'clock, and 10cc were winding up an uninterrupted hour of easy listening oldies. He brought his own bag, Hendrik said. What? The bag he used to suffocate her. He knew what he was doing. You can't just grab some carrier bag out of the kitchen. They're a waste of time. Most of them have got holes in, so your vegetables don't sweat or whatever. You want something airtight, obviously, and it needs to be a bit stronger, so it won't get cut to ribbons by a victim's fingernails, if she's got any. Hendricks tapped his fingers on the dash in time to the music. Also, with a nice, clear, polythene bag, you can see the face while you're doing it. I think that's probably important. So he was organised. He came prepared. He didn't bring the vinegar bottle, though. No, I'm guessing that was improvised. First thing he could grab hold of to hit her with. Then he gets the bag out once she's down. Hendricks nodded. Might even have hit her hard enough to do the job before he had a chance to suffocate her. I suppose we should hope so. I wouldn't bet on it, Hendricks said. You ask me, the bottle was just to make sure she wasn't going to struggle too much. He wanted to kill her with the bag, like I said. I reckon he wanted to watch. Jesus. I'll know tomorrow. The windows were beginning to steam up, so Thorne turned on the fan. They listened to the news for a couple of minutes. There was nothing to lift the mood even slightly, and there was nothing in the sports roundup to get excited about. The football season was still only a month or so old, and neither of their teams in action. None of the night's results proved particularly significant. 6 weeks until we stuff you again, Hendrik said. Our committed gunner. He was still relishing the double that Arsenal had done over Spurs in the North London derbies the previous season. Right. Hendricks was laughing and saying something else, but Thorne had stopped listening. He was staring down at the screen of his mobile, thumbing through the menu and checking he hadn't missed a message. Tom. Making sure he still had a decent signal. Tom, you okay, mate? Thorne put the phone away and turned. Is Louise all right? Hendricks waited, saw something in Thorne's face. Shit. Is it the baby? What? How do you know? Thorne pushed back hard on his seat and stared straight ahead. He and Louise had asked to tell nobody for the first 3 months. A good friend of hers had lost one early on. Don't be pissed off, Hendricks said. I forced it out of her. Of course you did. To be honest, I think she was desperate to spill the beans. Hendricks looked for a softening in Thorne's demeanour, but saw none. Come on, who else was she going to tell? Thorne glanced across, spat it out. I don't know, her mother? I think she might have told her as well. Fuck's sake. Nobody else as far as I know. Thorne leant down and turned off the radio. This was why we agreed we wouldn't say anything in case this happened. Shit, Hendrik said. Tell me. When Thorne had finished, Hendrik began telling him that these things usually happen for good reasons, that it was better now than later on. Thorne stopped him. Told him he'd heard it all already from the woman who'd done the scan, and that he wouldn't help too much then either. Thorne saw Henrik's face and apologized. I just didn't know what to say to her, you know. Nothing much you can say. Need to give it time, I suppose, Thorne said. Tell her to call me whenever she likes, Hendrik said. You know, If she wants to talk about it, Thorne nodded. She will. You too. He waited until Thorne looked over, all right? They sat in silence for a minute. There was still plenty of activity at the front of the house, vehicles coming and going every 2 minutes. Half a dozen spectators were growing on the opposite side of the road, despite the best efforts of the uniform to keep them away. Thorne let out an empty laugh and smacked his hand against the steering wheel. I told Lou I was going to get rid of this, he said. Your precious Beamer? Hendricks said. Bloody hell, that's a major concession. Thorne's a 1971 Pulsar yellow BMW had been a cause of much amusement to many of the colleagues for a long time. Thorne called it vintage. Dave Holland said that was just a euphemism for knackered old rustbucket. Promised I'd get something a bit more practical, Thorne said. He tugged at the collar of his jacket. A family car, you know. Hendricks smiled. You should still get rid of it, he said. We'll see. Hendricks pointed to the front door, to the metal trolley that was merging through it, being lifted down the step. Here we go. They got out of the car and walked slowly across to the rear of the mortuary van. Hendricks talked quietly to one of the mortuary assistants, ran through arrangements for the following morning. Thorne watched as the trolley was raised on its concertina legs and the black body bag was eased slowly into the vehicle. Emily Walker. Thorne glanced towards the onlookers, a teenager in a baseball cap shuffling his feet, an old woman open-mouthed. Not viable.